when you got so many minis to paint, but you don't have that many paints? Greetings and welcome to Mediocre Minis. This is the first episode in my limited palette, when I take a limited palette and paint minis. Kind of self-explanatory if you think about it. But no, this is a fun idea that I had to only use a very select number of paints and paint as many miniatures in as interesting ways as I can. This will be fun to learn about color mixing, how paints actually work, how to make things look vibrant, how to make things look dull. It's going to be a good time. If you're the type of individual who hears the phrase limited palette and goes, yeah, I get it, feel free to skip to this time code. If you want to hear a little bit more information about the palette I'm choosing and why, please hold for a few moments. Okay, onto the palette. This is going to sound a little bit crazy at first, but bear with me. The entire palette that I'll be using consists of 15 paints and 2 washes. Now you might think that sounds like a lot of paints, that's not very limited. Well, if you take a look on the wall behind me, you don't necessarily need that many paints. Effectively, you don't need that many paints at all. You can really kind of reduce it down to what I think could be these 15 paints and 2 washes. So breaking down our 15 paints, we'll start off with the first 6, and they are the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. Next section, we have 4 paints that are whites, blacks, and grays. A white, a black, a gray, and a off-white. Third up, we have what I'll call 2 browns and a khaki, because it's 2 browns and a khaki. A darker brown, a lighter brown, and a khaki color paint. Finally, our last 2 paints, went through pretty quick, are the only 2 metallics that we'll have, a gold and a silver. Finally, to wrap things up, we have 2 washes, a black wash and a brown or sepia wash. And that's it. That's everything. That's your 15 paints and 2 washes, which will comprise of the limited palette. Just a few more quick things about the palette moving forward before we actually get into the mini. First is the paint brand doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. I purposefully chose these paints that I have here from a diverse selection of brands that I happen to own. It doesn't matter. Choose a green that you have. A green's a green. It doesn't matter if it's intermediate green like I'm using or grass green from Reaper. It's a green. Same thing with a blue and a purple and everything else. Use what you have. You don't necessarily need to go out and get these exact colors because the brand doesn't matter. The exact shade doesn't matter. It's what you have on hand and working with what you have. All right, with all that out of the way, now let's actually get into the mini and painting the mini. All right. Taking a look at this miniature here, this is a Ranger from Reaper Miniatures. I believe I got this mini part of the Bones 5 Kickstarter, which was several years back now, I believe. I got a lot of these minis still to go through, and I'll be painting a lot more of these in the future. Generally speaking, I do like Reaper Miniatures a lot. I know some people think that they're simple and basic, but I tend to really enjoy painting them and using them in games. The sculpts are good enough for what they are, and for a few dollars a pop, you really can't complain too much. Before I got started with the Reaper Mini and the paint process, I gave it a bath in warm soapy water. This is just mostly to keep any mold residue or any mold release off the mini, so when I start painting it makes it a little bit easier. After the mini was dry, I know Reaper says you don't necessarily have to prime their minis, but I decided to anyway. It's just a simple mix of white and black to get myself a nice gray. I actually did this a few times. There was something else I tested out before this, but getting into the real paint job, I actually used Reaper Brush On Primer. They had a bottle of this at my LGS, so I picked this up and give it a shot. Sometimes white primer is a pain to work with, and this is slightly better than most white primers you get in a bottle. It's better brush on than other white primers, but it's still not amazing. So to help give it better coverage and everything else, I mix a small amount of black into it. And this is AK's black primer. Mixed that together and got myself this nice gray. And then, yeah, let that dry and then we get into the actual painting. Alright, going into the paint job for this miniature, I went for a relatively classic ranger look. They're out in the woods, so they're going to have some green on them. So simply green, dark browns, and other shades that would fit someone who's out in the forest. For the cloak, I mixed together my green and a small amount of the dark brown and mix them together and use that as my base coat. And the reason why I did this is so that the recesses will be a little bit darker for when I add highlights later on, so I don't have to go back in with a wash. I can just kind of skip that step and just start with a slightly darker shade of green to begin with. The leather bits of the model, accounting his shoes, gloves, and the quiver. Forgot the name. Quiver on his back are all painted with these just leather brown or the dark leather brown or the leather brown or the brown that you choose to be your leather. Again, there's going to be a lot of leather, so picking one that works really helps you out. For the wooden bow, I simply use the light brown that I happen to have. Give a simple base coat of the gray to the stone for the base. The silver on the chainmail also got painted that shade of silver as well. Now there's a small amount of skin. You only really see a small amount of the ranger's face. So I mixed some of the khaki with a little bit of my red together. And this gives a somewhat of a warmish, peachy, reddish type of color. That is simply what I used for the face. I kind of learned this idea or this recipe of your khaki and some red from Midwinter Minis, many of his videos when he just mixes a skin tone on the fly. I know using the khaki, red, brown, and sometimes some yellows or blues, you can get a wide variety of skin tones. So hopefully we can learn a lot about that in the future. Moving on to the highlights for this mini, relatively simple. The cloth, I went back to the straight green with no brown mixed in, and then added a small amount of off-white to make it a little bit brighter to give me some nice highlights on the edges of the cloak. And then a bit more off-white to add a lighter green for even more highlights. In many instances, you can push the highlights as far and as high as you want by adding simply more off-white most of the time. I normally only do it once or twice just to give some nice highlights. I don't push it too much further than that, but you can go as far as you want. Moving on to the leather, I did the leather two different ways, especially when it comes to shading and highlighting. And this is something I'm experimenting with, and hopefully I'll dive more into this soon. But one way I shaded the leather is by mixing brown, the leather brown, and a small amount of black together to get a darker brown for a shade tone. Another way that I tried this was black and purple, actually. Purple can actually give a pretty deep, dark look as well. And when I get into what will become a basics leather video, we'll dive into that more later on. But I use that mixture, both of them, different areas of the mini to shade some of the leather, some of the creases, some of the folds, for instance, between the fingers and some of the areas where the leather would crease. For the highlights, I did something similar. I used brown and I mixed highlights two different ways. One way I mixed was brown and the orange that I have. Mixing these two together gives obviously an orangey brown type of highlight, which you could see on worn leather on occasion. I also use brown and off-white to also make some highlights, just a different way of highlighting the mini. I plan on playing around with both of these methods a little bit more for leather, hopefully come up with a interesting, fun, and simple way to do leather on your own in the future. And for the wooden bow, I kept that very simple. Since the bow and even the arrows I painted to be the lighter brown, I simply gave those a wash with Sepia. I didn't really do any more additional highlighting. I kept it very, very simple because actually the color looked pretty good, and I was happy with how it looked just with a simple Sepia wash. And finally, for the base, I used the black wash to cover the base and fill in all of the nooks and crannies and darken the recesses really nicely. After that dried, I simply took the stone gray once again and went back over some of the edges and some of the areas to give the stones a little bit of a highlight, and I added some of the off-white into the stone mix to make it a lighter gray for a few more point highlights here and there. Oh, and of course you finish up the paint job with a black base ring. And there we go, a pretty simple paint job on this miniature using a pretty small selection of paints. What do you think? Do you think the paint job was good? Do you think the idea of painting more miniatures with a selected limited palette is a great idea? Let me know down in the comments, and I'm curious to see what you think. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of the limited palette. Thank you again for watching, and may the divine light your path.